Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Ricard Solé from University Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, where he's head of the Complex Systems Laboratory at the Institute of Evolutionary Biology. He's also external professor at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico and an ECLT fellow. And he studied biology and physics. So he let's say, has a broad view on the subjects that he studied, and he has been very productive for several decades. So he has made contributions to complex systems from the biology and from the physical perspective. And he will speak today about terraforming the biosphere. So it's a nice perspective on how to deal with climate change. So please, Ricard.
Okay, thanks, Carlos. Yes, my topic of my talk is something that you will see is highly interdisciplinary. It's controversial, and we believe that it might be a really relevant contribution to our future ways of dealing with global warming and, in general, the problems that our biosphere is going to face in the next decades. One of the issues in particular that we are particularly worried and that we want to address with our approximation is the fact, and is a generic feature of complex systems, that changes in ecosystems in the future are likely to be non-linear and non-continuous, meaning that as a number of issues, a number of factors affect biodiversity declines, the changes in ecosystems are not going to be smooth. It is predicted by different sources of analysis that tipping points will arise. In other words, once given thresholds of, say, aridity, precipitation, grazing, or CO2 concentration are reached, responses of ecosystems on different scales will involve catastrophic shifts. And this is a number of papers that have been exploring this question, and in particular, Martin Scheffer has been kind of the main advocate of this idea, as well as Tim Lenton. And this goes along with another important problem, which is the extreme events. We are not only going to face shifts in the future, we are also going to confront something that is also a relevant feature of complex systems too. Once you approach critical points, broad fluctuations are expected to happen. And that means that in a quite predictable way, we are going to see that big changes in local temperature, huge shifts in precipitations are going to be observed in local or regional scales. A year ago, for example, there was a trend that is happening more and more often. We saw temperatures of -50 degrees in the north of the United States, and at the same time, temperatures of +50 degrees in regions of Australia, which cause big death of animals. And also, a classical prediction from climate change is this idea that as soon as CO2 concentrations reach a given threshold, is very likely that our biosphere starts to experience a runaway effect, our planet, not the biosphere, meaning that temperatures will increase beyond control. And you might think that, well, 1, 2, 3 degrees might not be so important, but it is very important. As important as the prediction is that society will not be able to sustain itself. So we see that affecting biodiversity in particular, and the Anthropocene, the name we have been used to label this domain, this kind of geological era that has been created by humans. Biodiversity is declining in many ways. We know that species are being extinct, that populations are, in particular, for example, in insects, are experiencing huge decays. And again, the problem here is that this is likely to be accelerating in the future. You have to have in mind that unfortunately, the worst case scenarios of climate predictions seem to be the ones that are being fulfilled. So what can be done if we go beyond thinking in terms of modeling or analyzing data? What can be done in terms of trying to deal with that? One approximation, let me give you just two extreme examples. One approximation is, of course, protecting. Of course, we need, for example, to protect hotspots of biodiversity. There's been this conjecture by Wilson of what about protecting half of the planet? Maybe more close to reality is a number of studies, particularly Stuart Pym and co-workers, in doing estimations about what needs to be protected if we want to preserve a given fraction of the total biodiversity. And if you go into the other extreme of ways of dealing with that, it's the geoengineering, right? Geoengineering means that in order to counterbalance the increasing warming, why not to use engineering projects, which have to be mega scale projects where, for example, additional clouds are generated by these huge structures using seawater. This is all of these projects, as of course, are in the minds of the people who thought about that, have not been tried, and in general, the costs are staggering. Another possibility is using literally millions of mini satellites carrying mirrors to deflect the light of the sun, using aerosols. The problem of all these approaches is that beyond of course, the problem that we don't know exactly how they will work, or if they will, is that they of course do not solve the main problem. CO2 will be there and will remain there, right? And when we face all these problems, one of the important things, and it's a very important lesson from complexity, is that we need to know a little about what can be predicted, and to have in mind that ecosystems are, as any complex system, is a multi-scale issue. So if you look at this diagram here, from bottom to top, we'll have the ecosystem, pairwise interactions within given species, the way in a given species the genetic networks work, etc., etc. So when we move in any from one level to another, and that will be an issue that we'll discuss later on, it's important to know what kind of features from one level you need to actually predict the next level. And we have a lot of classical work in ecological theory about these kinds of ideas. And in particular, I want to emphasize that one thing we know, because ecology has been system science, is one of the precursors of complexity theory. We know that ecological systems are nonlinear, that they exhibit multiple attractors, meaning that you can have different potential equilibrium states. Okay, that sometimes is good, that sometimes is not so good. And that there's a number of memory effects, there are potential possibilities for control, and what can be learned from these lessons, and what kind of problems do we address? Let me just mention some problems that we face that have been characterized in a way or another by means of concepts from complex systems theory. One has to do with rainforests and the fact that rainforests are being lost quite quickly, that deforestation is kind of a really major issue. And we might have the picture that you can remove maybe 50% of the rainforest, that's not a big deal because you have the other 50%. But that's not the case. And the reason of that, and we know that also from very well-known theory, percolation theory, is that as soon as you get removing patches of vegetation from a given domain, you keep removing more and more of them. There are thresholds here too. When you cross a threshold, it's called the percolation threshold. And this has been actually characterized in this work by Francisca Tolbert and colleagues. It's been possible to actually calculate how close we are to the percolation threshold, where theory predicts that a major collapse can happen. Because once you fragment the system beyond that threshold, you get into something that essentially is not anymore a system, right? before the percolation threshold, you have a connected system. You can talk about the system. Once you cross that, you do not. And they made explicit predictions about that in 50 years, we could actually face that kind of phenomenon, right? And that would mean catastrophic consequences. Same happened with coral reefs. It's been an accelerated loss by coral bleaching. And that's a good example. Also, I'm going to explain in the end what kind of strategies are coming from bioengineering. And it's sad to see that you take books that were predicting the decay, for example, of corals, books from 30 years ago. The prediction was that about half the 21st century, we might see that half of corals might have been gone. Unfortunately, that already happened, right? So it's kind of showing us that predictions are actually were probably mild in terms of the situation. Multiple states, that's a really important question, important concept. And I think it's important because it's going to be relevant for the discussion we're going to make on bioengineering, but also because it illustrates the power of theory. Let me just mention very briefly that these alternative states, meaning that in ecosystem, you very often don't see a continuum class of different states, but sometimes just, for example, two potential states. Sometimes one is degraded and the other one is kind of the healthy one. One in particular is for shallow lakes. Shallow lakes, we have a lot of them in Europe and all over the place, can be found in two particular states. Crystal clear, we have this nice blue algae low-level lakes, or when you have lots of phosphorus, nitrogen that of course comes from humans, you can have algae blooms that usually take a lot of oxygen, make the lakes totally green, kill some diversity, right? Nobody likes that. And some years ago, Martin Scheffer was actually with other colleagues, did the following thing. They did a theory for understanding what was the nature of that transition. And they ended up suggesting or predicting that if you remove the large fish from this ecosystem, you will have a tipping in the system, shifting into the crystal clear state. The reason for that, in a nutshell, is that because fish act on zooplankton, fish are very abundant. You remove the fish, they do not act on the zooplankton, right? The zooplankton grows and can act on the phytoplankton, which is essentially the green algae, and you can go back into that state. They tried with fish tanks, it works, and then they convinced the mayor of some village to use that strategy in a lake that was in the green state, and it works. They show that the prediction is clearly not just a mathematical object, but it actually predicted well what could be done and how to apply it. Well, one particular context that we have been exploring, it's not the only one, I think it's very, very interesting, and you will see why it's so timely. It's drylands. Drylands is more than 40% of ecosystems in emergent lands. By drylands, I refer to systems that usually are characterized by patchy vegetation, a lot of hydric stress because there's low water content. Usually they might not seem so interesting, but they are extremely important in maintaining hydrological equilibrium. And about 40% of people in the world live there. So it's not really a minor thing. And these particular ecosystems might face and have faced in the past transitions from what we call the green to the desert state, meaning that as you increase in the diagram, in the lower diagram and right, in the x-axis, you will increase degradation of the soil. That could be because of intense grazing or less precipitation, or in general, what we call aridity is growing. And in the y-axis, you have vegetation cover. And the continuous line is showing that you decrease vegetation cover as you increase aridity in a kind of a smooth way. But once you reach a threshold, there's a catastrophic shift, right? Sonia Kefi, here in the picture, has been one of the major players in building a theory of that. And for those of you who might not believe me, this is a simulation with a cellular automaton, and I want to make the point that a number of different models have been used, more or less sophisticated, all of them pointing into that state, right, in the catastrophic shift. In this automaton, you see these patches that are the in silico vegetation, right? In the upper one, you see this patchy vegetation that is maintains itself in a given aridity level. Here is 0.13. But you just increase a little bit beyond the tipping point, you can see that you shift into the desert state, right? And an example of this is what you see here. This picture is a picture of the boundary between Egypt and Israel, right? In Egypt, you can see on the left is a really arid, almost desert system, right? Because grazing has been intensively been used, whereas in Israel, you can see the system is still working well. What can you do with that? How can you actually manage to revert the situation? Because the model suggests that once you cross the threshold, if you go back, nothing happens because you need to really go enough back into the previous state to jump into the vegetated state again. I'll give you an illustration of something that was done in China. It's more than 50 years ago in the Tenger Desert. There was this place where they have railroads because of increased aridity. Essentially, sand dunes were there. So it was the desert state that eventually were starting to cover the railroads. And they decided to do something on a large scale, right? Think about around this particular place, there is a semi-arid ecosystem. It's a dry land with vegetation. But in that particular part, there was just a lot of sand. So what they decided to do is to do a kind of an engineering effort, a massive one. I think it was this strip that I'm showing in the picture in the middle low. It's, I think it was 9 kilometers by 1 kilometer. They brought literally hundreds of tons of haystack, dried grass. They formed these patterns there. And after decades, and in some other interventions, the system was able to go back into the original, not really the original, but a dryland state, right? That's the whole effort you have to do. And this is a little spot in the end. So what can be done? And that's my suggestion. That's kind of the approach I'm suggesting in my talk. What about considering bioengineering the biosphere, not geoengineering? Meaning what? Meaning, as it sounds, meaning that why not to create machines, but not satellites with mirrors, create living machines, so using living cells that could actually be engineered to perform a function that could restore a given functionality that you might eventually lose and avoid the tipping points, right? So since we suggested that, that's kind of the half of the literature that you have right now. And the idea though is we want to create a synthetic organisms. Why is that? Because living organisms are machines, if you want, that replicate themselves. So you don't have to build all of them, they build themselves. And they have to spread on a given scale. That should be tested in micro and mesocosm experiments. That's what we are trying to do now. And then scalability should be explored. Well, in our proposal, in one of the funding papers that we published 5 years ago, we suggest actually that there's a small number of what we call terraformation motifs, right? We take the word terraformation, it might sound to you, it was originally used for talking about Mars, right? What about making Mars a nice place for living? I don't think this makes much sense. Really. Mars is there for killing us, but anyway, we can dream. But take the word to say, what if we can act on degraded, anthropogenic, or endangered ecosystems, making modifications in such a way, essentially, that we create mutualistic loops that help the system avoid the tipping points, right? It will be long to explain the 4 motifs. And I'm going to just mention one of them that we've been very actively working for drylands, right? One of the nice things of drylands, as I was saying, they might seem not as such an interesting kind of ecosystem, but they are extremely interesting, is that you can have this combination of vegetation, plants, right? And what's called the soil crust. The soil in drylands can be a really spectacular kind of ecosystem in itself, right? And the approach we're taking is the following. What we want to do is imagine that one of these drylands will face a tipping point, or might face a tipping point in the future, okay? Why is that? Well, we know now from the models that the nonlinearities accelerate some kind of particular phenomena that drive the system into extinction, into the deserts. So what if we could change some of these nonlinearities in such a way that we can make an engineered action to change the nature of the tipping point, and maybe actually remove it, and that is control. That's the point, controlling. I give you this example of that is used in synthetic biology to show you what's a little bit some of the approach we want to take. This is a particular problem that was explored some years ago. It's an active area of research. It has to do with concrete, in particular concrete cracks, right? Concrete is one of the major materials used in the Anthropocene. And it's a big issue in terms of infrastructures and maintaining infrastructure, because concrete, after a number of decades, starts to form cracks. And as soon as water goes into the cracks and reaches steel and other materials, this essentially deteriorates, right? So what could be done to actually solve this? And one approach that was thought by some people 15 years ago was the following. Imagine I could design a microorganism that secretes calcium carbonate and some polymer. Doesn't need to be some polymer that is secreted by the given species, could be totally different species. That has been done. That is a microorganism that lives well within the cracks. It's not a nice place for the vast majority of microorganisms. It's a basic pH environment, and most microorganisms don't like it. You can actually use a microorganism that only likes to live here. So the idea is the microorganism repopulates the crack, it seals it, and as soon as you go out, you die, because you are not going to be prepared to live in the outside. That's why we use the term engineering work and die, right? Sounds like a North Korean motto, but that's the idea, right? So what we have done a lot of theoretical work, right? As it happens in any ecology textbook, you can actually find out. The first step in terms of defining a theory is to actually define the simplest models, right? The models with small numbers of species, trying to calibrate when possible, and try to see how robust is the dynamics. Our specific design for drylands, right? And I'll tell you a little more about the plans in terms of experiments, is the following. This is this very nice drawing in the upper part, in the middle. This cube is kind of a little section of the soil crust, very rich in a number of species. And in particular, you have cyanobacteria. We know cyanobacteria quite well. We have a lot of tools to actually engineer them. And the idea is, and that's very important, you take something that is already in the community, so that is under the set of interactions that is already there in the mature ecosystem. We engineer this cyanobacteria so that it produces one particular polymer that could be completely non-biological, in such a way that this polymer is able to retain a little more water, right? The increased moisture. That cannot happen in crazy ways, because you are already in a system that is under hydric stress. But imagine that was possible. So you increase a little bit water retention, You help plants to actually maintain cover. And our hope is that it actually creates a cooperative loop that the models suggest that will push the tipping point far away, right? You'll explore that in this particular paper here, Population Dynamics of Synthetic Terraformation Motifs, and found out a number of additional predictions about what to expect. Is this doable? Is this something that we can actually do? Well, the first step, of course, is try in a mesocosm context. In other words, try under controlled conditions. A nice thing of the soil crust, and Fernando Maestre, who is one of the most influential ecologists in the area, is that they have been working in the last 20 years in performing control experiments with pieces of soil crust to explore the effects of increased temperature. And we believe that we can actually maintain this in a mesocosm facility. Nuria Condepolle here is the person responsible for my synthetic biology wet lab. And we could actually try and see what's the effect of actually manipulating cyanobacteria in this context. As I was saying, there's a lot of control experiments that gives us indirect evidence that what we have in mind is not unreasonable, right? And also we made some predictions and a lot of mathematical and computational model with here Blai Vidiella and Josep Sardañez in terms of actually predicting what would be the effects of that in spatially extended models. And a nice prediction from our work is that the synthetic intervention would create in particular a new phase, if you want, a phase where you might have no vegetation cover, but you could actually protect the soil. Nevertheless, you could have a soil that will be stable enough to maintain itself, right? Here, a number of mathematical results have been found, some of them counterintuitive and really very interesting. I wanted to make the point that in a way for all the motifs, the idea here is what we say, engineer ecosystem engineers, right? The concept of ecosystem engineer is a really powerful concept from ecology that's been there for many years now. Is the idea that there are species that have a particularly huge impact in ecosystems because they have a considerable control in terms of energy and matter. And I wanted to point out that some invader species actually have been shown to be ecosystem engineers that have been made a positive impact on the ecosystem they have invaded in terms of protecting biodiversity. I know what you're thinking, right? Yes, but how do you know this is not going to be a problem, right? How safe is this? Well, it's really interesting to look at that because when I started to work on this, of course, I went back in time into the literature in the 80s when all these genetic engineering ideas about modifying microorganisms started to be in place and deeply criticized. And one interesting thing is essentially that because of all the banning of genetic engineering, a gap of knowledge was created. Meaning what? Meaning that if I ask you, do you believe that there's life in another planet? The vast majority of the people that is listening here will say, yes, of course, right? And I myself will say so. But is this a really scientific answer? And the thing is, it's not. We don't know. We really don't know. It's possible to have unintended consequences by delivering an engineered organism in the context I'm mentioning. We don't know. That's the honest answer. But it's something else we can say. Well, let me tell a little story. When Jurassic Park was being, was prepared, all the plot, etc. The guy here, Jeff Goldblum, called the Santa Fe Institute to ask Doyne Farmer, who was there at the time, one of the fathers of chaos theory, to ask him about how does a mathematician working on chaos behave, right? Well, you have seen the movie, you see that no advice was taken. What can be done? Well, there's a lot of work that can be done from theory. Let me mention that one very interesting thing that I'm trying to explain to people from synthetic biology is that they keep thinking in how to avoid unintended consequences without knowing about a very well-defined area in ecology, which is known as invasion ecology. There's a lot of things we can learn from there. One experiment that we have been doing in silico with my student, Victor Maul, is precisely to see what would be the consequences using a multi-species ecosystem model, right? If you do exactly what I just mentioned to you, right? You take one species, you make a modification, that species, for example, can grow faster in a community. What happens if you use a diverse community? Because we know that diversity can protect from invaders. And it's been really nice to see that what happens is that typically you either fail or you remain in the system under the control of diversity. So I have suggested the idea that diversity can be a firewall for the kind of intervention that we suggest, right? More recently, we have been expanding the reach of our predictions, and in particular, the way we can actually explore these problems. Last year, we published this paper in Science, where a sampling from 60,000 points all over the world, right? That was an amazing work led by Miguel Verdugo here, showing that for drylands, there are kind of three essential disruption thresholds that, in particular, the two last involve the decay of vegetation in favor of shrubs and the loss of mycorrhiza, and finally, what's called a systemic breakdown, right? When you have the green desert transition. All this work is a long story to explain. All this work suggests a number of issues that have to deal with in terms of strategies for intervention. Is still soon to say exactly what. We are just developing a new model for actually explaining the origin of these transitions. But we started actually to think about what kind of interventions and where and when should be actually designed, right? Still soon, but something has to be done. And we recently organized a workshop at the Santa Fe Institute precisely to explore this problem, intervention scenarios. What else can be said? Well, let me finish with a few particular points that I think that suggest that the area will move fast, that the ideas we suggest might soon percolate. One is that there's a number of places where this kind of bioengineering approach can be used. There's a number of very well-defined strategies and problems that we have identified. Victor de Lorenzo here, which works at the Centro Nacional de Biotecnología in Madrid, has suggested that there are actually essentially 7 big microbial processes that should be manipulated to actually, if you want, being extreme, save the planet. And more recently, synthetic biology has been advanced quite quickly. More recently, an interesting breakthrough that shows the potential for actually creating organisms to go into the right direction is this work by a group of Ron Milo in Israel that they have forced the evolution of E. coli, right? E. coli is a heterotroph. It takes energy and matter and processes it in a metabolic way as us, not as plants. They force this microorganism to actually take CO2, right? In a way that only plants do, so become an autotroph. That opens the door of an enormous amount of possibilities, all right? It's been a long path in trying to get the attention and finding out ways of pushing this forward. Good news is that EMBL, European Molecular Biology Lab, has recently decided to expand their reach into ecosystems, and we hope to have a collaboration with them into the mesocosm experiments. And as crazy as my suggestions may seem, it seems that there's more crazy people there. This is a paper that led by Madeleine Van Open, where the suggestion is, and this idea of using what's called probiotics to actually act on endangered corals is becoming a really important strategy. What about modifying the microbiome in coral reefs, in corals, right? Making a synthetic microbiome that could help actually these corals persist, right? Same happens, for example, for kelp forest, right? These huge brown algae that are really also ecosystem engineers are in danger in many places in the world. What about using synthetic biology to actually push them away from decay, right? And almost finishing, one of the suggestions we have for other terraformation motifs have to do with a number of scenarios that are far from natural systems, right? For example, sewers in cities. I mean, nobody likes sewage except the Batman maybe, but it's a potentially great possibility. These are immense bioreactors in urban centers. Cities, of course, are really big part of the problem. It has to be part of the solution. What about engineering this, right? Engineering microorganisms to perform a given function that could be from CO2 capturing to other possibilities that can be defined, right? And in general, manipulating the microbiome offers a number of amazing possibilities for health. And that's my last slide. What do we want? As a former theoretical ecologist, and when I was younger, I was a naturalist. I mean, I wish I could just say, just let's protect biodiversity. Let's do what is reasonable, which is actually do not exploit nature the way that we do, right? I want to make one point clear. I'm not in favor of the idea that technology will save us. I think we need a really big transformation in terms of society, energy use, inequality, etc., etc. But unfortunately, things happen very quickly. I do think that technology is part of the story, right? That would mean that we intervene, and that would mean that we change nature, right? But let's not forget that we are already doing everything wrong, and that we need to, at least, we need to have some time to solve the problems. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricard. If you have questions, please type them in the YouTube chat. There's already one or two. While the questions gather, Ricard, I wanted to reflect on something that I mean you already mentioned, but I guess we are terrible at evaluating risk, and many people say, "Oh no, don't try this because there's a risk that something might go wrong." Mm-hmm. And the alternative would be, "Oh, then let's not do anything and let's continue doing what we've been doing, and at least there's, I mean, we have the certainty that things will go wrong, very bad if we continue on that track." But it's difficult to measure risk, like to say, okay, if we do this intervention, either geoengineering or bioengineering or whatever, there's this risk that something will go wrong. Mm-hmm. As you say, we don't know because we've never done it. So you cannot calculate risk from first principles. It can be made only a posteriori. So, but I mean, I'm also in favor of acting instead of just letting, let's say, the situation drift us, and let's say we'll see what will be, and the planet will adapt, and we will adapt. I guess in this case it's better to try to do things actively, and the risk will be lower. But I don't know whether you could comment a bit more on that.
Yeah, that's the big issue. I mean, first of all, I want to emphasize. I mean, I'm collaborating with a group of really gifted field ecologists, not just crazy theoreticians. These people that is really concerned about conservation, and they believe that this a possibility has to be explored to the list. The second thing is that tipping points change our perception of risk. It's not like biodiversity is going to decline slowly, and at some point we might do something. If tipping points exist, risk has to be seen in another way. But let me point into something that I think that is the big point that I can make. Usually people say, okay, you take one bacterium from the system, you change it, you put it back, the synthetic one, and you hope it will reinforce something there. And but how do you know this is something that is going to work? Let me make the following question here. The experiment I was so to speak experiment. The intervention that was done by the Chinese in the Tenggara Desert involved the following. You take thousands of tons of grass from somewhere else, so totally exotic, which is essentially filled by billions of bacteria from an outside ecosystem. Why is this not something that can have unintended consequences, right? We might think in that like, this is fine, this is something that is nice. I don't see the point. And that kind of intervention has been done repeatedly in restoration, and there's usually no objection, right? So we need to actually thinking about real biology, and in particular that things like horizontal gene transfer are happening all the time in microbiomes everywhere. And that doesn't mean that the system gets crazy.
Yeah. Gabriel Ramos Fernandez asks, why synthetic organisms? Do we really understand how to put together an organism with the desired properties? Why not use the organisms originally present in the degraded ecosystems to restore them? Another way to ask the same, what do we understand better, the functioning of ecosystems and what they lose when degraded, or how organisms develop functions of interest?
Well, these are open questions. There's not much I can say if we attach ourselves from results. How are these microorganisms work? We do know from a number of experiments that if you just take microorganisms from the lab, so from outside the context of the real ecosystem, and you try to put them living in the real world, right? They usually die very easily, right? They are not able to persist. They are not adapted. They are not part of the original ecology. So again, there's something that has to be tried. The point that we make is that because you have a community already that is stable, even if the system is confronting tipping points in the future, and you put a slightly different strain that might shift some of the basic properties of the soil, the community is likely to shift also, right? How far? The model suggests that not that far from the original state, okay? And that one has to be tested. I mean, until we do that, it's difficult to really say.
Yeah. At the beginning of the pandemic, I remember a cartoon that it was like a wave, well, a tsunami, better said, COVID, and then a larger tsunami, economic crisis, and then a larger tsunami, climate crisis, or climate change. And let's say, given the terrible way that we've handled the pandemics, I guess it's not very encouraging to see how we'll handle climate change. But I don't know whether you have some information about the consequences that will be expected, because many people think like, oh, well, yeah, the sea levels will rise, but it will be only in 80 years and we won't be around. And of course, if you notice that there are already severe effects of climate change that we are suffering, and I mean, it's difficult to quantify, but I don't know whether, on the one hand, there is a source of data of what's the impact or the expected impact in the next few years, and whether you have any idea on what could be done for coordinating efforts to.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I think that you're right. I mean, the pandemic should show us at least one important lesson. This is a global problem. It's not something we can just solve at home. The second thing is that I remember precisely at the Santa Fe Institute, kind of 30 years ago. I was a meeting about climate change, and there was this guy talking about predictions for 30 years ahead. And there was major floods in Central Europe, big mega fires in Australia, etc., etc. That's precisely what happened. So clearly science is able to predict. We are facing something really serious. I mean, sometimes you see these articles talking about the end of the century and how a few degrees might interfere from our possibility of adapting. Several degrees of the extra temperature will be catastrophic. There's no such a thing as adapting to 3 more degrees. And we can say that 2050 will be kind of the turning point. You need to really make serious action before reaching this horizon 2050. And since things accelerate, you see the trends of accelerating both CO2, but also these major extreme events. We cannot adapt to this size of events, right? And we need to put control on that before we reach this kind of tipping points.
Yeah, today I read news that Miami's population is growing, and the mayor wants to attract tech workers because since there are less restrictions, then some people want to go and live in Miami because there's no quarantine. And I'm like, what do you mean? They should be evacuating the city to be underwater in a few years. And well, I don't know.
It's important to have in mind that one of the big problems with humans is that before the tipping point is there, it's something called panic, and that in places like Syria, where the several a long-term drought made people from the peri-urban areas to go into the cities. That was something that was somehow announced by climate models. I mean, it wasn't the cause of the war, but it was clearly a really important element there. And you don't need to die from starvation to actually decide that you want to move and abandon the place you live. And the sociocultural and socioecological issues are really, really relevant.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Ricard. Very interesting topics that we should ponder and